Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Maddie here, and today we have Meta Monday. That's sort of the new name that I'm calling this video series. So Monday basically is a great time to take a look at the current metagame for Pokemon TCG Pocket and do all of our analysis. The reason for that is that the biggest online tournament for Pokemon TCG Pocket happens on the weekend, on Saturday and Sunday. That is the Ursa Days Pocket Weekly. Now, this week, Ursa Days Pocket Weekly, as you can see here, had 1,940 players, so almost 2,000 players competing in this one online tournament for Pokemon TCG Pocket. So basically what we're going to do every week is we're going to take a look at this tournament, and we're going to kind of give a great sort of summary of the metagame right now and how things are changing week to week. That's sort of my plan here with Meta Monday. That's what we're going to call it. Comment down below, Meta Monday. Does it work? Does it sound good? I don't know. We'll see. But yeah, so it kind of just makes a lot of sense, right? So what we could do is take a look at all of these different smaller tournaments and get a better view maybe in some ways. But the thing is, the larger sample size gives us a great representation of the metagame at this moment in time. So 2,000 players is a pretty large sample size, and I think that it kind of is a great way to reflect on how the metagame is changing in Pokemon TCG Pocket, at least for this week. So on Mondays, we're going to review the Ursa Days Pocket Weekly, the largest tournament, and we're going to take a look at the metagame. So let's dive right into this. So these are the final standings. As we can see here, Mewtwo EX and Gardevoir won the tournament, and then below it we have a couple Pikachu and some Strikers, and then again in the top 8 we have another Mewtwo, we have a couple Gyarados and Greninjas. Nothing too surprising here. However, we did see an Executor EX with Mew EX deck, which we'll take a look at in a sec, getting 7th place, and then we had a Charizard and Arcanine kind of sneak in. And if you go down a little bit, this is where we'll find a lot of those anti-meta fighting decks. We have one right here, the Primeape deck, we have another one right here, and then we have our Mew EX fighting package deck here as well, that got getting 15th. A couple Pikachu and Raichu sneaking down a little bit farther, a lot more fighting decks as we go on. We did actually see a Blaine's deck make it into 26th place here, which is pretty decent for Blaine's, if we're being honest with you. It's actually pretty good. And we also had a Alakazam and Mewtwo, both kind of anti-meta decks to their own, in their own respect, rather, making it fairly high up here, but yeah, this is the top standings for this tournament. So let's take a look at some of these decks to see maybe how things might change with the specific deck lists as things go on here going into this week. So I did already look at this Mewtwo deck, which I thought was really interesting. And the cool thing about this Mewtwo deck is that we're not actually seeing any Mew EX. And this is really, really interesting. It kind of makes a lot of sense. So yes, Mew EX is really good in Mewtwo. We all know this, but it's really there for specific matchups. Mewtwo EX is still the primary attacker in the deck, and it does well against a lot of the different decks in the format, but I think a lot of people realized that they were seeing maybe a lot less Charizard in the format, which is kind of where we were slotting Mew EX in more specifically for, because in the last format of Genetic Apex, Charizard was sort of a top 3 or top 4 deck, and it did do really well against Mewtwo, so it made a lot of sense to kind of put Mew EX into Mewtwo to kind of help with that matchup. But we're seeing a lot less Charizard decks, and we're seeing a lot more Gyarados decks. Therefore, it makes a lot of sense to run a secondary attacker as like Jinx. Now, Jinx from Genetic Apex is really strong. Psychic, it does 30 damage, and it does 30 more for each energy attached to your opponent's active Pokemon. This is going to be good against Gyarados that typically has 4 energies attached to it. This is a lot of damage. A lot of times can get a Revenge KO on a Gyarados, which is strong, but it's also good against Celebi for a Revenge KO in those matchups where people are kind of stacking up their energies on Celebi. It's also a basic Pokemon for only 2 energies. If Gardevoir is set up, we can set up Jinx in 1 turn. We can literally bench it, put it into play. We don't have to invest energies or anything in it, so it's not really changing our game plan or the flow of our deck really at all, and we can kind of just throw in Jinx, get it up there, set it up in 1 turn, and probably take a 1-hit KO on a lot of different Pokemon in the format. So I think Jinx is really good. It makes a lot of sense right now in this current metagame to not necessarily be preparing for things like Gyarados, and to be preparing for things like, not be preparing for things like Charizard, and be prepared a little bit more for things like Gyarados or Celebi specifically. Now, Celebi is still a pretty high play deck, and Mew does have a decent Celebi matchup, but in general, I think Jinx is actually pretty good. It's not something we really want to lead off with, so 1 copy of it does make a lot of sense. But yeah, so I thought that was interesting. The top placing Mewtwo deck was not running Mew EX. That's something a little bit different. We haven't seen that. Now let's quickly take a look at the 5th place Mewtwo deck, the one that got 2nd best, which is including Mew EX. This is a much more typical list. However, what we do see here is blue, and what blue I think does a lot of times is protect us in certain math scenarios. It's also a good counter card for things like Celebi or even Gyarados that might be hitting you with a Giovanni to do that 150 damage. But the thing is here, here, Mewtwo having 150 damage, of course, Celebi does damage, its attack does damage in intervals of 50, right? So if they flip 2 heads, they do 100. If they flip 3 heads with their attack, they do 150. And early in the game, it can feel really bad if your Mewtwo gets KO'd in the active spot by a Celebi that flips 3 coins and gets all heads. So what Blue does in a lot of different ways is fix the math, especially with Celebi. Even if they have 3 coin flips to do their attack, 3 energies on Celebi, they still, if you're playing Blue, right, they still aren't able to KO you. If you don't know what Blue does, it reduces the damage that all of your Pokemon take on your opponent's next turn by 10. So if a Celebi flips 3 heads on you while you have Blue in play, he's only hitting you for 140. That way you're living, and that really can be the difference a lot of times. But like I said, against Gyarados or against maybe even Pikachu and Raichu as well, with a Giovanni doing 140 damage, or Pidgeot also doing 140 damage, there's actually quite a few cards that do 140. It kind of makes a lot of sense to, slot Blue into Mewtwo EX, because there's not really a lot of cards that are necessarily really useful. I don't think Potion is that useful in Mewtwo right now. Tempo decks are a lot less popular. Aggro is around, but I mean, you're going to have a pretty decent matchup anyway against Aggro because we're a Psychic type deck. And aggro decks are typically fighting. So yeah, I think Blue is really interesting. So this deck includes Mew EX, but it includes Blue instead of Jinx, where the last deck, didn't include the blues, but it included Jinx, which I thought was really very interesting. Let's take a look. I don't think we're going to see anything surprising here out of the Pikachu and some Strika decks. I am kind of just assuming these are going to be the same thing. Yeah, so we actually see one Dedenne in here, which is pretty cool. But other than that, very standard. Pikachu and Substrika is kind of the same deck. It's been the same for a very long time. And yes, it actually did do the best. Now, it did see the most play out of any of the Pikachu decks. This deck is also kind of the same here. A little bit slow here. Let's see if we can load. Okay. So yeah, and then the other 2 decks were Gyarados and Greninja. I'm kind of assuming that these are kind of all the same. Yeah. The Gyarados Greninja decks are really kind of figured out at the moment. There's not too much kind of going on that's going to be surprising. I'm not even going to open these deck lists. I guess I'll open it up for the video in case you don't know, but I think everybody has seen a Gyarados deck in the last couple weeks here. Very popular, of course. 2 Druddigon, 2 Gyarados with 2 Magikarp, Froakie, Frogadier, Greninja. I mean, this really is the strongest deck in the game right now. We'll take a look at sort of the the win rates and the overall kind of metagame standings here in a little bit, but the only way to counter Gyarados is to put a lot of pressure on this Magikarp that only has 30 HP. There's a lot of ways to do that. Substrike is one of them, does 30 to the bench, as well as Hitmonlee and a lot of those aggro fighting type decks can also snipe a bench Pokemon for 30. Also, an early Sabrina can be really detrimental against Gyarados as well. But if Gyarados gets set up and if you don't really find a way to counter it in the early game, there's really not much you can do. It just has so much HP, it does so much damage. It's just incredibly strong. So no surprise here, in my opinion. Now, I was personally expecting last week when I did sort of my meta-analysis of my tier list, I was sort of expecting Pikachu and Raichu to be a little bit more successful as time went on than Pikachu and Substrika, because mainly that deck seemed a little bit more flexible because the new Electabuzz was also able to do bench damage and it worked with Surge, so it made a little bit more sense to me. But I guess Pikachu and Raichu is a little bit more faster pace. Pikachu and Substrika is a little more faster pace. It's a little more of an aggressive deck, where Pikachu and Raichu is a little bit more mid-range, a little bit more tempo-based, longer games. It takes a little bit longer, but has a bigger payoff. And I think in the format right now, sort of a lot of decks would rather be on the aggro side of things than not. Pikachu as a tempo deck, I think being able to flex into more of an aggro deck does make a lot of sense. So Pikachu and Substrika seems to be sort of the top way to play Pikachu at the moment. However, Pikachu and Raichu is still a good choice, but I think as far as the meta is currently at the moment, we would rather have a little bit more of an aggressive deck list, which is why Pikachu and Substrika is sort of at the top of the Pikachu decks. We'll take a look at all that in a little bit. I just want to take a look specifically at some of the deck lists before we get into the real data crunching. So here's one thing that I found really, really interesting. Now, I put Celebi with Executor pretty high up at actually an A tier on my meta tier list last week, and I still believe that the best way to play Celebi EX is really in an Executor deck. I think that Celebi should be sort of an ancillary piece in the deck, and this, in my opinion, is actually my favorite way to play Celebi. Again, Celebi struggles a lot because it's sort of, when you're playing the Jungle Totem Superior, it's really a late game setup and sweep deck. The problem with Celebi is it's very easily to revenge KO. It only has 130 HP, so there's a lot of Pokemon in the game that can sort of just KO Celebi once it comes into the active spot, takes a KO. you bring up your revenge attacker and you take a KO on Celebi. So the real reason why I think Celebi struggles a lot of times is because it doesn't work very well in that type of a deck. It doesn't have a lot of HP, whereas something like Exeggutor right now is actually really aggressive in nature. It's a stage 1 Pokemon, you can attack for only 1 HP, it's a really good card going first, and there's not a lot of cards that like to go first in the format right now. Typically stage 1 Pokemon with attack costs of 1 are really good going first. We saw that in the Primate deck, that Primate Aerodactyl sort of aggro fighting deck. There's a reason why the new Primate is good. It seems underwhelming, it's a stage 1, only does 50 damage for 1 energy, but that's really aggressive when you think about it, and it's strong going first. You can attack, right, with an evolution Pokemon on your second turn if you go first, which is really strong. Exeggutor is the same way. In a lot of ways, Exeggutor paired with Erica's, as we see 2 Ericas in the deck right now, it's really strong. 2 Sabrinas as well, so we can kind of, put some early pressure on a benched Magikarp, something like that. Again, the upside with Exeggutor, and the reason why I think it's best to focus on Exeggutor, is because it's the best frontline Pokemon, at least by far the best frontline grass Pokemon. It's what we want to start with. It's what we want to have in the active spot for a very long time. It can be really annoying. It can take some KOs, right? A lot of decks that are a little bit slower to build up, Exeggutor can just take 1 or 2 KOs before anything can KO it. And by the time your Exeggutor goes down on top of, the 2 Ericas and being able to extend the lifespan of that Exeggutor for such a long time, we can just manually, stack those energies on a Celebi EX or stack it on a Mew EX to get that last final KO, that revenge KO once your Exeggutor goes down. So this is personally, in my opinion, the best way to play Celebi. Maybe not this exact 20 card list. The stage 1 Exeggutor is interesting for sure, but again, it makes the deck a little bit more consistent and it's a little bit more aggro based, right? This new Exeggutor here is actually pretty decent if you think about it, because it's still a stage 1 Pokemon. It's got an attack cost of 1, just like the other Exeggutor, but we have the chance to do 30 to 60 damage on a coin flip, which is very aggressive, right? There's a lot of basic Pokemon in the active spot that have 60 HP or less, right? If you think about it, right? Whether that's sort of a, let's see, like a Charmander in a Charizard deck, or a Ralts in a Mewtwo deck, a Magikarp, or even a Froakie in Gyarados. There's a lot of basic sort of stage 1 Pokemon that can get KO'd on your second turn by that, both the Exeggutor EX and the new Exeggutor, right? The non-EX one. So it's actually a really aggressive deck. And again, Celebi here in this deck isn't necessarily your trump card, or it is rather your trump card. It's not necessarily the focal point of your deck. We're putting a lot of weight into Exeggutor, which I actually really think is really good. And again, less Pokemon in this deck makes the deck flow a little bit more consistently. We can find our Celebi and our Mew EX easily because we're only running 4 basic Pokemon in this deck. So it flows really easily, really well. And then we have room to play 2 Ericas and 2 Potions. So this is one thing that I would really take away from this meta analysis, is that Celebi EX isn't a bad card, and it's not a bad deck. I just think that right now people need to sort of change the way they're playing Celebi based on how the meta is shifting right now. Don't play Celebi with Superior. I mean, you can, and you probably can still win a lot of games, but in this new meta where things are kind of focused more, a little bit more on being like an aggro, faster paced metagame, it makes sense to play something that kind of fits the meta a little bit more. And I think that having Exeggutor EX as the focal point of your deck makes a little bit more sense. Now, of course, this isn't sort of a super highly played deck, but look, we got 10, 2, and 1. We got 7th place out of 2,000 players, and this is a deck that very little people played. We did see a Celebi and Superior here. Again, it makes sense. I think if we look at the meta report, there was probably 100 or so people playing Celebi and Superior. But if you take a look here, look, we also have an Exeggutor EX in this list. So again, the representation for Celebi is still fairly high, and I think it should be. I think that Celebi is pretty comfortably an A tier or B tier deck. I just think for now, the best way to play Celebi, and I mean really for right now, the best way to play Celebi EX is going to be with Exeggutor. And look at down here in 17th place, we're going to see another Exeggutor-focused Celebi deck. So there's a definitely a theme here, right? And this deck's actually running 1 Snivy, which I think is really interesting for sure. Running the Genetic Apex Execute to do that 20 damage with C-Bomb. Pretty good chip damage here if you're going second on your first turn. It can be pretty decent. This deck's running 2 Celebis, no Mew EX, but it is running the Jungle Totem Superior. But either way, if you want to run Jungle Totem Superior, that's fine. Definitely do it. It makes the deck flow a little bit more clunky because there's so many Pokemon in the deck. But that deck that we just looked at kind of tried to get around it by playing only 1 Snivy to kind of increase the odds to pull like your Celebis and your Executes off of your Pokeball, which is certainly interesting. But like I said, guys, I think Exeggutor is actually should be the focal point of your grass type / Celebi deck. So that's sort of just my opinion. And we did see a Charizard sneak into the top 8, and this is going to be sort of the classic Genetic Apex Charizard with the inclusion of Leaf to help get our Moltres out of the active spot a little bit more consistently. So I'm going to spend a minute here just talking about Charizard in this format and, you know, Fire-type decks in general. So I personally still think that the best version of the Moltres Fire-type archetype is just straight Arcanine with an inclusion of Mew EX. I think it's best in most matchups. Now, the only thing that you need to understand is that, and I'll say this all the time, that the consistency of a deck doesn't necessarily determine the strength of a deck, right? So just because your deck is much more consistent, it flows better most of the time, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to win more tournaments or that you're going to have a better standing in a tournament. The thing with Charizard EX, and it's always been the case, is that it has a really high upside, right? If you get really lucky with Charizard game after game after game, there's very few decks that can hang with it. Now, Charizard isn't the most consistent deck. Of course, you have to evolve your Charmander into your Charmeleon into your Charizard. You have to get 4 energies onto your Charizard, which probably means you're going to have to start with Moltres or get Moltres in the active spot. We are running Growlithe and Arcanine to be a little bit more of a tempo-based option. Very Pokemon heavy in here. There's a lot of things going on, so it's very RNG dependent, this deck is. But if you draw well and if you get lucky, there's really nothing a lot of decks can do. You really just become one of the strongest decks in the game. So in a tournament setting, out of like, I don't know, maybe 50 to 100 people that are playing this specific Charizard deck, the chances are that at least one person gets really lucky is pretty decent, right? And that one lucky player is going to do really, really well. As we can see here, 10, 2, and 1, 8th place with Charizard and Arcanine. And if we go down here, there's a 9 and 2 Charizard and Arcanine, and an 8, 1, and 2 right here. So 25th place, 19th place, and 8th place, right? So not great, you know, standings here, I guess, compared to all of the other decks for Charizard and Arcanine, but Charizard will always have the potential to do that, whereas I think Arcanine with, you know, Moltres, straight Arcanine with Mew with Moltres is honestly a better deck. It's more consistent. It isn't necessarily going to place higher because its total upside, right, like its peak performance isn't nearly as high as Charizard, which probably has, you know, upwards with Gyarados, probably the highest performance in the game. And a lot of people aren't necessarily countering Charizard anymore, as we saw with that Mewtwo deck running Jinx instead of Mew EX. It just isn't necessarily something that a lot of decks are, you know, accounting for when they're sort of building their strategies. Okay, so lastly, before we get into the other sort of, you know, the data at least, let's take a look at this Primate deck. This is something that I did not really see coming. When Golem won last week's like 2,000 or 1,500 player tournament, for me it made a lot of sense that fighting type was going to become much more popular because the rise of Pikachu being played because of the dominance of Gyarados made sense that fighting would come in and have a pretty decent spot in the metagame. However, what I didn't expect was that all of these fighting type decks to sort of just morph into aggro focused decks. However, in hindsight, it does make sense because kind of the best functions of this deck are the Hitmonlee, the Marshadow, and the fact that you're really fast paced and you have a lot of counters to a lot of setup and sweep decks like Mewtwo, like Celebi, like Gyarados, like Charizard, which are kind of the most popular decks in the game right now. It makes a lot of sense that sort of a fast-paced aggro archetype would be really good. But the one thing that I just didn't really think about was this new Primeape from Mythical Island. It seems really underwhelming, and if you can see it on the screen here, it's a stage 1 Pokemon, fighting type. It has 80 HP, which isn't that much, especially for a stage 1 Pokemon, and it just has the attack Punch. For 1 fighting energy, you do 50 damage. This seems like a very underwhelming card, but again, you gotta think about it like this. Mankey is a basic Pokemon that actually has the potential to do a lot of damage. As we can see here, Focus Fist, it's a 50-50 chance to do 50 damage. However, the Genetic Apex Mankey, or the new one, I forget, has a Low Kick, which just does 20 damage for 1 energy. So it's actually a really aggressive card. Whether we're going first or second, we have an option to attack on our first turn. And if we're going first on our second turn, we can just attack with Primeape for 50 damage, right? Which again, paired with Giovanni, paired with Sabrina, is actually really aggressive, and it gives us the opportunity to start doing damage really early in the game. We also have something like a Hitmonlee we can start with to just start poking something on the bench from our first turn. We have Marshadow as well to be a revenge attacker, and the fact that you're able to play so many single prize Pokemon in this deck means that our opponent basically has to always KO 3 Pokemon. Yes, we are running Aerodactyl EX, but for the most part, it's kind of sitting on the bench. Late in the game, we can bring it up because it probably at that point will have 2 energies onto it, and 80 damage is a pretty decent amount of damage. 140 HP isn't bad either on a stage 1 EX Pokemon. But basically, your opponent is going to be forced to go through a Primeape, which is going to be punching it probably 4 or 5 times before we're able to KO it. And then we go in with our Marshadow, we, revenge attack for 100 damage, which is, again, a lot. Or we can go into Hitmonlee, kind of kill something on the bench. And then our opponent still has to KO probably our Aerodactyl EX. So it's a very aggressive, a very fast-paced deck. This is kind of the most popular version of fighting type decks. I did just make a video on a Mew EX fighting type deck, which I think is pretty good as well. It's more of a tempo slash aggro deck. So it's not fully invested in sort of that aggro playstyle. It's a little bit flex between a tempo deck, kind of like Pikachu, and an aggro deck like, like we're seeing here. It does include Aerodactyl EX, but if you haven't seen that video, go check it out. It's a very fun deck. I think it's really well positioned in the meta right now. It's a little bit quirky, so it's probably not going to see as much play as something like this, which has become a little bit more mainstream. But yeah, the fighting type decks have risen in popularity for sure. However, this tournament, they didn't have a great outing, but if we go down a bit, we see that the representation for these aggro fighting decks, and here it is actually, this Mew EX Aerodactyl, it is actually really good. It just didn't necessarily, place anywhere in the top 8, but anywhere in the top 16, top 32, it's actually pretty well represented. It's right here, it's right in the mix amongst the other most popular decks right now, which is what you're going to see being Gyarados, Mewtwo, Celebi, Pikachu, and then the fighting type decks, and then sort of Charizard and Arcanine kind of sprinkled in. So yeah, very interesting, but that's kind of how the meta is going right now. It's very much, tempo slash aggro focused to kind of help counter some of those setup and sweep decks, which I think makes a lot of sense in my opinion. And I think that fighting type cards and a lot of the fighting type Pokemon have a really good, play style, fast paced, early damage play style, which I think is really good. So yeah, let's take a look. I think this is probably going to be, this is really interesting. Okay, so this is going to be, again, a much more sort of tempo flex version of these fighting type deck lists. As we can see, we have something like a Tauros, an Aerodactyl, and a Mew EX, which are a little bit more tempo-based cards. They're pretty good for revenge KOs. And then we have one Hitmonlee to start into the active spot, which I think is very interesting. One Marshadow. This is different than the deck I was playing. So instead of running 2 Tauros, I was running 2 Mew EX with 2 Marshadow and 2 Hitmonlee, and no Tauros in the deck. Tauros is actually pretty interesting, in my opinion. I'd have to think about it a little bit more, whether or not I think Tauros is a great option. There's just not a lot here. I would like to maybe see, another Hitmonlee as a basically another starting option to go first. But I do like this a lot. So again, it's sort of a tempo flex fighting type deck. It's kind of got a little bit of the best of both worlds, which I think there is certainly a place for these Mew EX fighting type deck lists that again kind of flex between being sort of a tempo based deck similar to Pikachu and its sort of pacing and its playstyle, and then or an aggro deck like we see here with these primate decks. But yeah, nothing else too crazy here that's standing out to me. Let's take a look at this Blaine's deck. I'd be interested to see sort of how they were playing Blaine's. Looks to be pretty standard. Yeah, very, very standard Blaine's deck. 2 Ponyta, 2 Vulpix, 2 Ninetales, and then one of each of the new Rapidash, which is pretty cool. We're one of the old, one of the new Rapidash, and then just a bunch of, fill-in sort of supporter cards. 1 Sabrina, 1 Giovanni, 2 Blaine's. I would actually like to see a second Sabrina, and maybe cut a potion from the deck. I think that Sabrina is really good right now, especially if your deck is a more faster-paced deck. The ability to put that pressure on the bench early on in the game is really good, especially if your deck doesn't have any sort of a bench-hitting Pokemon like Hitmonlee or a Zebstrika, for sure. Okay, so let's quickly take a look at this Alakazam deck as well, and then we'll go and we'll take a look at sort of the overall data analytics here. So this is going to be a it's not really a Mewtwo deck. It really is sort of a setup and sweep Alakazam deck, as we see here with the 2 Druddigon. Again, kind of that Pokemon to stall in the active spot, fix some of that math while we set up our Alakazam, and we just start attacking turn after turn. The upside with Alakazam, opposed to Mewtwo EX, is that you don't discard any energy. So once you get the Alakazam set up, even though it only has 130 HP, which is really a really little amount of HP for a stage 2 Pokemon, it's actually going to function very similar to Celebi, where you kind of just keep Druddigon in the active spot, or Gyarados rather. It's going to take a bunch of hits, take some KOs, do some chip damage on your opponent. We could also go into our Sigilyph and attack with Spike Draw to draw some cards, help us set up our Alakazam a little bit more, while we kind of sweep through our opponent by taking big knockouts with the pretty decent amount of damage that Psychic does on Alakazam. We also have a Mewtwo EX, which I thought was pretty interesting. I don't necessarily know why. Maybe just for that 50 damage, or maybe in really late game scenarios we can set up a Mewtwo and an Alakazam, which is certainly interesting. But the upside with Alakazam is that it does counter something sometimes like Celebi or Gyarados. It does more damage based on the energy that's attached to your opponent's active Pokemon. There's a lot of Pokemon right now that have a lot of energy attached to them, Gyarados and Celebi kind of being 2 primary ones, so it makes a lot of sense. Unfortunately, like I said, it gets revenge KO'd very easily with only 130 HP, so I don't really think that Alakazam as a setup and sweep Pokemon is going to be, super meta game right now, even though right now it is a pretty decent meta counter to a lot of the other other popular decks. The other upside though with Alakazam is that we are able to utilize Mythical Slab to help sort of draw into our Pokemon a little bit more consistently, which I think is pretty cool. It's not necessarily as good in this deck because we have 2 Druddigon, but maybe we can kind of filter those Druddigons out with research and Pokeball before we play our Mythical Slab in this deck list. But very interesting. Alakazam is an interesting card. I think it's pretty underrated, at least as a meta pick, an anti-meta choice right now. But other than that, kind of a meme deck there to do pretty well and do pretty well in the tournament, get a pretty high placing, which I thought was definitely really interesting. Now there's going to be a million decks here that go 8-2, and we could kind of look through these, all day. There was a Marowak deck that went 8-2. Let's see here, what do we got? A couple far-fetched aggro decks again going 8-2, which is pretty cool. But everything else in here pretty standard. It's all kind of the same stuff. So let's go ahead. Let's take a look at the actual sort of metagame analysis, and we'll take a look at what the most played decks were. This can be a little bit misleading, so we have to translate this a little bit. As we can see here, it says that Gyarados and Greninja was the most played deck, but really we should be combining sort of all of the Pikachu decks into one. And as we can see here, 173 plus 143, that's 216, plus 30, that's 246, or 346 rather. Which is interesting. That would put Pikachu as the most played deck in the game right now. So that's something to keep in mind. If you're kind of analyzing the meta from this tournament, it does look like Gyarados and Mewtwo were the most played decks right now, but they really weren't. In fact, Pikachu was the most played deck by a pretty wide margin as well, being above 300 people playing all of the different versions of Pikachu, that is. So if you combine them, Pikachu EX definitely the most played deck in the game right now. Let's take a look at Celebi and combine them up. We see 104 and 57, so about 160 people played Celebi EX, which would put it at the fourth or fifth most played deck. And then let's look at the sort of the Charizard decks here. We see 50 and 50, that's 134. So 135 people or so were playing Charizard, which again kind of puts it in that fourth or fifth place. So that's sort of the overall metagame right now. Pikachu, kind of the number one choice still, mainly because it's been rising in play rate, mainly just because Gyarados is so popular, and Pikachu, especially with Zipstrike, has a really good Gyarados matchup again. So it just makes a lot of sense that Pikachu has risen to be the most played deck right now, with Gyarados and Mewtwo being very close behind. Those are, in my opinion, are really the 2 strongest decks right now, Gyarados and Mewtwo. I put them both in the S tier on my tier list last week. It does make a lot of sense that they would be the most played decks. And then if we go down, we actually see here, look at Golem. Golem's, sitting around here at 111 HP. It's still sticking around from the last week when it won the tournament. Unfortunately, the win rate for Golem wasn't very good. We'll take a look at the win rates here in a second. And then if we go down, let's take a look at some of just the aggro decks, which I thought would rise a little bit more in popularity. But as we can see, the fighting type decks and the archetype of fighting was actually pretty heavily dominated by Golem and Druddigon, even though it probably isn't the best fighting type choice right now. That might be kind of partly due to me. On my tier list, I actually did put Golem in S tier. I do think Golem is really good right now. I think this win rate and these results don't necessarily speak to how good Golem is. I think that people maybe just need to play the deck a little bit differently or have a little bit more time, understanding sort of its matchups, but very interesting to see Golem have such a high representation, but a very low win rate, right? Out of anything sort of in the top 10 most played decks, Golem was extremely low. Partially might be due to me, to be 100% honest with you, but yeah, it's interesting that the win rate was so low. I actually kind of want to look at the matchup spreads for Golem. There's plenty of decks that did decent, but I think at the top tables it kind of just struggled. So yeah, struggling against Gyarados, struggling against Mewtwo, but good against the Pikachu decks. Pretty average against Celebi as well. And then, yeah, kind of struggling against the fire type decks as well, right? That makes sense that we would struggle against Charizard. So I guess it makes sense. If you're playing a fighting type deck, Golem isn't a bad option, but I think there's better sort of late game sweeper decks. It could be a decent anti-meta pick, right? If Pikachu decks, like, it's just one of those things where if Pikachu ends up dominating sort of the top tables and top cut, it would make sense that Golem kind of comes through. And if it also makes top cut, it kind of just rolls over all of the Pikachu decks, probably like we saw last week. So it's kind of an anti-meta Pikachu deck that has the ability to win tournaments. Necessarily probably not the best overall meta spread, but again, if we're talking about trying to win tournaments, I do think Golem is still a pretty good pick. 37 people playing the Aggro Primeape deck. If we go down here, let's see. So yeah, it's a Mew EX and Farfetch'd, 23 people playing this. Aerodactyl and Farfetch'd, 13 people. So the aggro decks, at least how it's sort of broken out here in the metagame, are very spread out, right? It's not necessarily categorizing things Aerodactyl and Mew EX. You know, it's not all packaging them together, even though they really are kind of all the same archetype. They're just played a little bit differently. These decks actually had really good win rates across the board. As you can see, 60% from Aerodactyl and Primeape, and Mew EX had a 51%, with Farfetch'd, Aerodactyl, Farfetch'd 51%. Let's see here. Where was the Aerodactyl and Mew EX? 61% win rate, even though the sample sizes are a little bit smaller there, which is pretty funny. Let's filter by the win rate, shall we? And then take a look at some of the things that stand out. So again, the sample sizes for a lot of these are going to be really small, so we don't really want to look at that. Let's take a look at some of the outliers of the decks that actually had pretty decent representation. And as we can see, out of any of the decks that had, you know, somewhat, you know, decent amount of representation in the tournament, the Aerodactyl and Primeape, sort of the aggro fighting deck, ended up being the most, you know, winning the most at 61%. 37 players, which is pretty good. Now, the thing is, the more people that play a deck, the more it's going to fall closer to 50% win rate. It's just the way that the math works. Everything sort of evens out. And then we actually see your 34 players. Charizard and Arcanine had a 53% win rate, which is pretty decent. And then Arcanine and Moltres here, a 53 or 52% win rate as well. And then we go down here, Executor and Celebi, floating around 51%. I do think Executor isn't necessarily that bad right now, so it makes a lot of sense to be, again, around 50%. And then if we go down here, Mew Farfetch'd, okay, yeah. And then basically, this is why you see kind of all of the most popular decks being below 50% on the win rate. The main reason for that is just because so many people are playing them. It just sort of works out that way. A lot of the people that play the decks, the most popular decks rather, might necessarily not know exactly how to play, right? A lot of the more kind of newer players or less experienced players are going to choose, you know, kind of the most popular deck list, which is why we see the win rates really low. But again, it doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot, especially when the sample size is so large. It just isn't necessarily kind of break out that way. I think that's probably something that we saw with Mewtwo here, right? Only a 44% win rate across the tournament, but it did win the tournament, and it did also get 5th place. So we're not doubting the power of Mewtwo EX based off of that win rate there. And the win rates here don't necessarily make that much sense. They're not really something to take a look at in a very high degree, but it is interesting rather to just take a look at sort of the overall meta share and to see how many people are playing decks. Let's go down a little bit, see if we can pull some info about some of this stuff. So only 17 people playing Ninetales and Rapidash. Pretty average win rate here. However, we did see one that was in, I think, the top 16 or top 20, which was pretty good. Starmie and Gyarados EX really struggled in this tournament. It's definitely not something that's kind of picked up in play. I think as an option to play Gyarados, we would rather just go all in on the Gyarados strategy. Starmie EX is a pretty good card, but again, it struggles a lot against Pikachu, which is another tempo deck that hits it for weakness. And Pikachu is really just sort of a better tempo card than Starmie, so it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense to play Starmie, at least in the format right now. Even though it is a pretty good card, we would rather just play Gyarados with Greninja. Scolipede only really dropped down a lot in play right here. It's like not even in the top 10 most played decks, and unfortunately a very bad win rate as well at only 35%. I do think it's a really bad time, personally, to play Scolipede. I just don't think that it's necessarily very strong into anything in the format right now other than Mewtwo. I put Scolipede pretty high on the on my tier list because I didn't actually think it was a bad deck. I think the problem is, again, it just struggles really tremendously against things like Gyarados and Charizard, which, you know, they're really just unwinnable matchups for you. Yes, you're good against Mewtwo EX, and your matchup against Pikachu and Celebi is pretty average, but again, not doing well against Gyarados or Charizard makes it really difficult to kind of justify playing your deck, at least right now. Even though you have a good Mewtwo matchup, it just, I don't know. It makes sense that Scolipede isn't necessarily this high. I would like to see Weezing decks in general be a little bit more played and have more representation, but unfortunately, there just still hasn't been a great reason to play Weezing right now or a great Pokemon to play with it. Maybe when the next set comes out and we see a new Dark-type EX Pokemon that maybe fits really well with Weezing, it'll be a little bit more interesting to see, but we'll wait and see. But for now, yeah, Scolipede is really just not it. It's not something that probably we should be playing, even though I don't think it's a bad deck. I just don't think it's necessarily well positioned for how the metagame is going. And then down here we see Pidgeot. I know people were really high on Pidgeot. I said it last week. Pidgeot's just not a real deck. It just isn't necessarily something that's worth playing above anything else that we see above here on the metagame. That's why only 14 people played Pidgeot, and it didn't really win much at all. And if we go down here, there's nothing really too surprising, I suppose. Nothing really stands out. A lot of sort of fighting type decks here or there, like really kind of mixed and matched fighting type decks. But I think as the time goes on, sort of the metagame, people will kind of focus around it, right? It's understood, at least from the Gyarados, Mewtwo, Pikachu perspective, and Celebi to some degree, how we should be playing these deck lists, except right now with the fighting type decks, there's so much variety. People are really kind of figuring out the best way to play the fighting type decks. However, I think right now, what fighting type decks do best is sort of that aggro, fast-paced playstyle. So I think things like Primate make a lot of sense. But also, if you wanted to play a more tempo-based fighting deck with Aerodactyl and Mewtwo EX, like the video I posted yesterday, you certainly could do that as well. So I think that's definitely an option. Golem is sort of that late-game sweeper fighting type deck. But again, I think there's better other versions of the late-game sweeper decks. It's good against Pikachu, but that's about it. So not necessarily a great reason to play Golem. I would expect Golem to see a lot less play for sure. And I would probably like to see Executor see much more play as well. Celebi EX, just without Executor, had twice as many players as Executor EX, and I just don't really think that's great. The win rate really does reflect that, but also the standings and overall, like if you get your hands on and you play Celebi enough, you realize that Executor is really, really good. We talked about that a little bit earlier in the video, so not much really else to cover there per se, but Executor is good. That's sort of the takeaway here of this video. So yeah, so what are we looking at here? I'll probably make another tier list this week at some point, kind of talking about what the best decks to play in the format are, given this information or the information that we have so far over the last week or so. But the things that I would take away is that Gyarados still really a top tier deck. Mewtwo also a top tier deck, although it's countered a little bit more in the metagame right now. You still have the potential to win tournaments like crazy. It's still a very strong, consistent deck. Pikachu EX has kind of risen back up to be the most played deck in the format right now, even though its matchup spread isn't that great. At least Pikachu and Zebstrika's matchup spread isn't that great. We do have a good Gyarados matchup, and it makes a lot of sense to try to play Pikachu to counter Gyarados. Probably the best anti-Gyarados deck right now, aside from aggro fighting type decks, which should see a lot more play as things go on, because they are really good into the metagame right now. And if we see a massive rise of aggro fighting decks in the format over the next couple weeks, we'll see the format kind of shift back around to, again, other tempo decks, opening up a lot more room for other tempo decks, maybe even like an Articuno or Starmie, or even Arcanine to be a little bit more prevalent as well to kind of counter those decks. So that should be pretty interesting for sure. Charizard's still pretty good. You can still win decks with it. Golem, not necessarily the best choice right now. And yeah, that's sort of the metagame of this week. That's how things are changing. So we're gonna go ahead. We're gonna wrap it up there. I've done a lot of talking. This is a very long video. So, but hopefully it was interesting to you guys. This has been Meta Monday. That's what we're calling it. Meta Monday. Meta Monday. I don't know how it sounds. Comment below, how do you think it sounds? But either way, thank you guys so much for watching. The support has been incredible, and I really appreciate everybody that has kind of tuned into the videos and tuned into the channel over the last few weeks. I have had an absolute blast sort of covering Pokemon TCG Pocket, covering deck lists, covering the metagame, and helping different players, new players, and experienced players kind of understanding the game a little bit more, or maybe the decks that they should be playing. So yeah, it's been a great time. But anyway, guys, I really appreciate it. I'm gonna get out of here. Peace out. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button if you're still watching at 37 minutes and 40 seconds. Wow. Okay. Anyway, we're gonna get out of here. Peace out, guys. Have a good one.